Hi, welcome to How Literature Can Save the World, where we explore the written word's impact on our culture and our relationships with ourselves, each other, and the environment. I'm your host, Michelle R. Brady. I am a writer, editor, and attorney who just wants to talk about how we use the power of words for good and where you can find the ones that will help you see the world in a different way, like traveling without leaving your house. So, grab a drink or a blanket or an animal to pet, and let's begin to make our lives more meaningful one book at a time.
The trouble that mankind makes is that he thinks he's Italian, he's German, he's Spanish. We're all humans on this beautiful paradise is our earth.
So, all right, people, today, right now, we get to talk to Joe Meno. So, congratulations to us. We have arrived. For those of you who don't know, Joe is the author of Hairstyles the Damned, Marvel and a Wonder, The Boy Detective Fails, Book of Extraordinary Tragedies, Between Everything and Nothing, which I want to talk about later, and others. Like his short story collection, Demons in the Spring, which was, I think, a finalist for the Story Prize.
That's
Um,
correct.
yeah, and one of my favorite collections to date. I'm really picky about story collections. I think a lot of people are, and I couldn't stop reading it. So,
Oh,
congrats.
thanks so much. Thank you.
He's also a professor in the creative writing department at Columbia College Chicago, where he was one of my teachers 20 years ago, right after I got back from Iraq, and it was still the fiction department. I don't know. I think that it has kind of changed, though, hasn't it, at this
It
point?
has, yeah. We're at this really interesting moment, I think, in talking about or studying creative writing, where when I went to grad school in the 90s, you would go to grad school, study writing, and the end goal was to make a book of some kind. It could be a book of poems, a book of essays, a book of short stories, a novel. And the idea is you'd study for a couple of years, you'd workshop, develop work, and then at the end you would have this material that you would turn into a book. And what we've seen over the last 25 years, especially in the last 10, is this radical reimagining of how creative writing works, especially beyond a three-dimensional text, and how we use creative writing to build everything from multimedia experiments, scripts, thinking about the ways technology can be used with creative writing. And so just recently at Columbia, we had the opportunity to revise and kind of reimagine the major to be a little more adaptable, and to bring in these other multimedia elements, which is really, really exciting.
Yeah, well, I feel like you're the perfect person to be a part of any of this. I mean, I know you say that everyone's doing different types of writing, but you are really prolific and quite varied. Let's talk about how you wrote a nonfiction book, you wrote plays, you incorporate music into your work. You've written serial stories like Star Witness and Electric Lit, video essays, and you have all these different ways to try to express yourself and that you sort of experiment with. And I know that you're saying it as though it's normal, but I don't know that it is, and I think it's pretty impressive and interesting, and I was gonna ask you this later, but let's just dive right in. I'd like to know, where you get your ideas. Is working with students, I imagine, can be sort of, renewing in a way, like, everybody's interested in different things and gives you some ideas there too, but, what makes you branch out so much? Or am I just in the dark and everyone is doing
N-
this?
No, I love that question. Thank you so much. And again, thank you so much for the kind words about my work. And there's two, I think, animating forces. One is just curiosity.
Yeah.
I'm just really, really deeply curious in some way I don't even think I can explain, in it a semi-religious or spiritual way, about storytelling and narrative. From a very young age, from the time I could read, there was something transportive, something kind of this feeling of transcendence associated with just reading, whether it was a book, um, short stories, comic books, TV shows, film, narrative that showed up in music. There was something about it that I can't describe other than it being this opportunity to leave your experience leave your body to like go beyond who you were as like a kid or as a person, teenager, as an adult. And so there's something like just about the curiosity of like what are the boundaries, limits? Are there boundaries and limits? How does storytelling continue to evolve and like renew itself, which is like just this endless series of questions. And then the counter emotion to that is a deep fear and like restlessness and question of like relevance and how as a writer, I began publishing in the late 90s. My first book came out when I was 24 years old in 1999, and it was such an incredible opportunity. I was so young, I didn't recognize how lucky and fortunate I was, and I'm so glad in some ways I didn't recognize how lucky and fortunate I was, um, because it was very at the same time, it was very humbling, and I just was like, "Oh, this is what writers do. They, like, write works, and they just, like, publish them," and
Yeah, so really.
it wasn't easy, like, it was really actually really, really hard, like, I spent, 2 years working at a head shop, working as a flower delivery person where every moment I wasn't at work, I was writing. And it wasn't like it just was luck. It was like a lot of hard work and also a lot of luck. And I happened to write a book at a time in the culture when certain kinds of stories um, were or certain kinds of books were being published, and so there was a lot of timing and luck that goes along with, but I also like was crazy enough as a 22-year-old to finish, 250-page novel.
Yeah.
And so there's like this interesting balance between like, is luck some element that is associated with just like you have to do the work still, and or is it just purely out of your control? I think it's, like 60-40 or 75-25 or 25-7 or something. There's some relationship between like doing the work and also being in the right time at the right place. But because my first book came out when I was 24, so this is 1999, I've had this like wonderful and terrifying opportunity to see how radically um, storytelling, fiction writing, publishing has all shifted in the last 25 years, especially I would say in the last like 10 years, there's been this like chaotic, beautiful, frightening acceleration of the way people interact with story. And even, you mentioned my students and because I work with 18, 19-year-old students, like it's very humbling. They don't care who you are. They don't like
Yep.
look up the books that you've
They don't?
published.
We did.
No, no. Well, they don't. Well, they're just like they're like you're just like a professor. You're like an old white guy. I could be 35, I could be 75, like, just anything over yeah, like, anything over 20 or 25, and, um and I like that. I actually, like, kind of really love I love being humble because at heart, like, I still like learning, I still like being a student, and so you're in there, and they're like, "We don't read."
Oh god.
And so you're like, "Okay, alright, interesting. Alright, how are we gonna so we're gonna do a lot of reading this semester, and, like, how's that gonna work?" Or they're like, "We read everything on our phones." And you're like, "Okay, interesting." So and then, like, I'm experiencing as an instructor, but also as a writer thinking like, "Well, how do I generate short story for people who solely read or only get news from TikTok or Instagram?" And like, how does that change the way that you generate material? And that like the constant updating, revision, acceleration, evolution of like platforms and how we've shifted really like I mean I've seen it happen. We've shifted from like a text-based society first with newspapers, then the original kind of 1.0 internet to like, most of my students now are getting information visually through photos, through like text to image. None of them are just sitting
Through
in
photos, like,
yeah,
what information can be gleaned? What if it's AI?
I mean, that's a huge question. That's like a huge question for them. But like they're getting information through photos, meaning like when you scroll through Instagram or TikTok, it's all through visual information. It's very little text. And so I'm not saying we're in a post-text society,
I'm just
but
I'm just broadly hinting it.
yeah, well, I'm like pretty sure if you're under 30, you are.
Yeah.
And so, like, what does it mean to write a book? What does it mean to write a novel? What does it mean to write a short story or essay for a culture that's like increasingly less interested in just alphabetic text on a page, like static text on a page? And so, like, you can either be heartbroken and and feel like you said, like angry and just walk around and um kind of look backwards. Or you can say, like, this is an interesting opportunity to think about the way text works differently in certain formats. Like, I'm not going to write a 20-page nonfiction essay and put it up on Instagram. I'm going to do a 1 minute, 30-second essay with text and image and music and see if I can get people to engage with the question of the essay. And so it's just like it's that curiosity and fear of like how do you stay relevant as a writer in the face of all these cultural, political, and technological changes. And you're like if you're really playing the game, if you're really paying attention, you have to feel like like you can't rest. Like you can't just like, oh, I did this thing 10 years ago. Cause nobody like the cultural memory seems to be about 3 days.
Oh my
So you
god.
could have done something really, really interesting like a year ago. And I was like, what? Like, that's not like a year. What are you talking about?
Yeah.
Um, and I like that because I've always been a writer. I'm really interested in the building part. Like when I'm most happy is when I'm making something. And so like as soon as it's over, like, I don't wanna look at it, I don't wanna talk about it, and that kind of forces me to move on to the next thing, and so the acceleration in the culture has kinda played to and you can see this with musicians and filmmakers and other people making cultural objects right now, like, you know, so, like, someone's putting out, like, an album once every year. It used to be 3 years between record albums or a film, like, every year or, like, the number of seasons for a TV show, and so I like the challenge of it. I definitely have questions in this kinda new moment of, like, how people get their work seen.
Yeah.
And it seems like the biggest like, we have this, opening up that feels much more democratic than 25 years ago where there are all these gatekeepers, various, publishers, agents, editors in, publishing or for film or television studio execs, and now people can, like, make work on their own
Mhm.
and get it out there. What what shifted, though, is that there's not 3 TV networks, and so there's not the strength and support in terms of, like, getting if there's a really interesting piece of work, it's harder for that to get out there. It feels much more chaotic and random.
Yeah.
Um and so it's trying to find the balance between, I think, those different forces and just make work that feels exciting to you, that you feel like, "Oh, this is meaningful. This feels somewhat, dangerous," or, "Do I feel like I'm going out on a limb here, or do I feel like I'm making something I haven't made before?"
Yeah. Yeah, I totally get that, but sorry, I have to go back to the part where you said that your students aren't reading at all, just because they're in a creative writing program, right? Like,
Yeah.
I don't understand that, and it made me think about, you wrote, I think an essay in Electric Lit about Harry Potter. Um, I actually don't remember all of the details about it, but it was about escapism and how fantasy is like, I remember you saying something like, "We're walking around and all these adults with no kids are dressed to the nines, basically, and just really desperate to live in this bubble, right? And we're hiding from feeling." And from feeling the way we need to feel to change things, because emotions cause actions and people
Right.
have to feel and engage. And I mean, that's the whole point of this podcast, right? So you don't even have to leave your house or talk to a stranger to start the process, that leads to action. You can just pick up a book where nobody sees you and quietly try to understand other people's points of view. Because if you have a point of view, so does every other human on
Right.
Earth. And spoiler alert, it's not the same. So I thought your essay was really interesting because in part of it you talked about teaching and you said that sometimes students don't want to read things because they don't want to feel sad or scared. And it kind of made me feel like, students expect us, not me, I'm not really a teacher, but to protect them from books that make them think too hard or feel
Right.
things.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I know that this is I mean, I have my own thoughts, but I think that trigger warnings are really dangerous. I think that in certain points, they're important. I mean, there are important parts, like it would be nice to know if somebody's going to have a flashback to something terrible, but I feel like it's extending way too far. I don't
I
know.
think it's a really fascinating question. There's kind of like 2 or 3 or 5 or whatever, how many questions here, but, like, one about the reading,
Oh, yeah, sorry.
they do read, right? Like, there's books that they love that they feel deeply about, and that's why they're, majoring in
Okay.
creative writing or taking a creative writing class. They have, like, a deep connection to reading, but generally, they're books that they read in high school, usually books that weren't assigned to them, usually books that aren't, like, traditionally literary. So, they might be books that are more rooted in fantasy, or romance or science fiction, and, like, whatever it takes. I grew up and saw these films and watched television shows and read comic books, and that led me to being interested in writing. It doesn't really matter how or why,
Yeah.
just that you feel this, like, deep connection with language. The difference is with the advent of kinda Internet 2.0 and the way that, Internet culture has kinda intervened in real life, the idea that in a classroom you're gonna be asked to read a text that might be challenging or might present complicated characters, unlikable characters, really difficult adult situations. Like, this recognition, maybe over the last 10 years, that kinda surfaced for me was that instead of being in high school seeking out writers like, I don't know, Hubert Selby Jr. or William Burroughs or Toni Morrison or William Faulkner, or, the book for me, I think when I was in high school was Catcher in the Rye by J.D. Salinger, books that were adult
Yeah.
oriented, even if they had younger characters, books that dealt with sexuality, books that dealt with violence, books that dealt with race, that you were reading those already in high school, and then you would come into college with kind of a background in some sort of adult literature.
Yeah.
That's been a huge shift. So, maybe kids are reading The Odyssey, or maybe they're reading, um, The Great Gatsby, but them eh, they're reading them in a class, they're not, like, seeking them out on their own,
Right.
and so, um, when they come into a class and you ask them to read Beloved by Toni Morrison, they just don't have the context in terms of, like, the language, the complex they're like, "These characters are bad."
No.
Like that, and that's their response, and in some ways, they're right. Like, you're like, "Oh, yeah, this is, like, a deeply, deeply flawed character."
Yeah, like a
They
human, like a person.
like a real human, like a real human, And you also see, like, underneath all of this is the influence of Disney in both film and television on a whole generation of kids, like kids who grew up and saw these Disney films, all these Disney TV shows, the Marvel films, the Star Wars films that generally present like these very one-dimensional, virtuous, flawless kind of characters.
Yeah.
And then when they confront like a character, Setha, the main character in Beloved, who's this woman who escaped slavery and made this incredible, like this impossible decision,
Yeah.
um, with her own children, like they just don't have the practice. They don't have the context. They're like, "Wait, I'm gonna have to read 300 pages about this really complicated character who maybe did, like, the most horrible thing I can think of." Like, they just don't have the, training, and that's fine, but there used to be a kind of a curiosity or this, like, expectation or insistence, like, that's why you were here. You were here to read these really compelling, challenging, difficult books, and that's just, like, in terms of the characters, because I would say most adult literature, like, really interesting adult literature, literature that interests me, literature that I feel like I can learn from, the basic concept is, like, these are complicated human beings, and we're gonna read 10-page short story or 300-page novel exploring what's complicated about them. And that's like that you're introducing that concept to an 18 or 19-year-old versus them coming in with that concept and, like, wanting to learn more about it. That's a huge shift. And then the other really, really massive shift is, as you're mentioning, like, this idea of, content or trigger warnings. And in some ways, like, that's something that was, incorporated from the internet, on fan fiction sites and various,
I didn't know that.
yeah, like, that's where well, originally, like, the original impetus was Vietnam vets who were coming back from the Vietnam War in certain situations, whether it was, like, in a class or, like, in a writing, course, like, they would use this idea of, like, trigger warning for vets who had, like, seen combat as a way to, like, help them avoid having, like, a PTSD reaction to, some of the things being discussed, and that's, like, so specific,
Yeah.
and that feels, very thoughtful, useful, like, that degree of trauma that a vet might still be, like, working through, that you'd be like, "Okay, hey, we're gonna discuss this thing," but if you're still kinda, like, working through this thing, like, "Okay, I wanna give you a heads up."
Right.
And that got incorporated, kinda used in a huge array of different circumstances, like, from s like, character smoking to, like, the suggestion of sexuality to, like, issues of violence. And so the way that, in real life culture, we're trying to figure out, okay, how do I help students navigate challenging material where they're, like, supported, but also have to deal with the larger questions that a story or novel or essay might be asking. And so, um, like, we talk about these questions, but before we, like, engage with the text, I don't offer, a trigger warning. I say, like, "Hey, this book is about, you know, the enslavement of people, and we're gonna listen to a podcast and talk about," because a lot of, 18, 19-year-olds right now, like, their understanding of history has, been for a variety of reasons, like, their understanding of history, is very narrow. Some of that's purposeful, like post 2020 when parents were forced to stay home with their children during the pandemic and they got a lot more involved in what was going on in their kids' schools.
I love how you say forced to stay home with their
Well,
kids.
they
Oh, yeah, you're totally right, you're totally right.
they were, and so, like, they suddenly got really involved in what students were learning, particularly in, like, history class. So there's 20 states that passed these really regressive laws about what teachers can talk about, whether it's dealing with politics, whether it deals with race, whether it deals with slavery, whether it deals with queer culture. Like, and so students are showing up in college with, like, this much narrower picture, um, and, like, just the idea of something like the Civil War or World War II or slavery, like, it's kinda all one thing to them. It's like something that happened before they were born.
Yeah.
And so I do spend time, like, if we read a book like Beloved, we're gonna listen to some podcasts, we're gonna look at some texts before we actually look at the thing just to give them some context.
Yeah.
But I'm not gonna say like, "Hey, this is something we should be scared of, something we should avoid." I want them to have the expectation that just as you do as an adult in real life, that, like, there are beautiful and dangerous things in the world, and, like, writing is a tool that we have to help us navigate these uncertainties. But, like, pretending those things don't exist or putting a warning every time, um, especially in a fictional context,
Right.
something like that's gonna get mentioned. I don't I think it's not entirely, helpful. I think it starts to help them normalize that, oh, like adult life, there's beautiful things and there's also troubling things, and that's the expectation, not that you're guaranteed safety.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah,
and
exactly.
and that's okay. It just took me a while as an instructor to learn, like, oh, this culture grew up on the internet, grew up with social media, their expectation for comfort, their expectation for safety, their expectation for reassurance is like way, way higher. And like that's okay. Like that's totally okay if I know that's what the context and I can adjust. And in some ways, group of students I have now, like the Gen Z students, 18, 19, 20 year olds, they do require, a little more support in that regard. However, they are the most earnest, like, most thoughtful, most, like, socially justice-oriented, like, they are the, like, kindest human beings, I think, in 25 years of teaching.
Oh, that's
I've
so
never
good.
worked it. So it's like it's this amazing trade-off of like, okay, like we're gonna have to talk through some of this stuff in a very different way than I had to when I first started teaching. But also there was like a glibness, there was like a distance, there was this very ironic, kind of ironic posture 25 years ago in the
Yeah.
in the 90s that is totally absent from the way students show up in class, from what they're writing. They're, like, willing to talk about these really deeply personal, difficult things in a way that I think 25 years ago, very few writing students were willing to, even begin to negotiate in their writing.
Yeah. That's so interesting that you said that because I was thinking about when I went to law school really late, like, so I was at least a decade older than my peers, but I remember just being blown away by how smart and thoughtful and considerate and interested in change and hopeful everyone was, and I just thought, "Oh my god, we're gonna be fine." Like, this is the future, then I think we're gonna be okay. But on the other hand, I do wonder if it's because I mean, everyone is happy before they leave the bubble. How long does it last? I don't
Right.
know.
Right. Well, I think, yeah, from my interactions with my students, I feel incredibly optimistic. I also, like I said, I feel very, very humble. Many times I'm like, my students are smarter, they're kinder, they're like more empathetic than I am. I need to be more like my students.
Yeah, you're the ironic one now. You're like,
Yeah, or not even because they don't like, they don't want it, like, it doesn't go over, like, your little, reference to some '80s TV show, like, it's totally useless, and so, like, I'll be totally honest, Michelle, like, I've gotten to this point as an instructor, I've spent half my life. I'm 51, so I've been teaching since 1999. So for 26 years, half my life, I've taught at the institution and worked with all these different kinds of students. And I- yeah, I feel like the best thing I can do as an instructor is like I set up the course, I set up the assignments, I set up the in-class activities, I set up the readings, I like lead or start the discussions,
mm,
and the best thing that I can do is, like, become invisible over the course of an individual class or over the course of the semester. This started in about 2019 or so. I have hearing loss, and, I started losing my hearing in my early 30s, and by the time the pandemic started, when we went back to in-person teaching in the fall of 2020, I could not hear
Mm.
what students were saying because of the masks,
Yeah. Oh,
and
yeah.
also because we had, like, social distancing, so there'd be, like, a class of 30 students in a room for, like, 150 students, and so I'd, like, walk around the room and could not hear anything anyone was saying. I finally, like, um, lost some of my ego and got hearing aids, and that made, like, a huge difference. But I realized that was more effective, I think, as an instructor when I was there to, like, set up the class, set up the structure, and let the students ultimately have, like, ownership of the individual parts of class, of, like, the entire semester, and that, like, as the class goes on and as, like, as the semester goes on, I, like, genuinely imagine myself becoming, like, invisible, and that, like, they don't really by the end of the semester, the goal is that they're, like, self-sufficient in their own curiosity and exploration and the work that they're making, and that you're just there, like, to intervene if necessary or make a suggestion like that. I never, want to feel as an instructor that I know more than my students, that my opinion about writing or literature is more valid than I just have some history or experience or wisdom that I can offer. But sometimes the students like, hey, thanks. No, I'm not. Yeah, I'm not interested in that. And I'm like, that's great, like,
Good for
and
you. Yeah.
that they feel
Yeah.
empowered, where you're like, hey, I think this story would be great if you started here. And they're like, "Oh, okay, but I really like this thing." And in a traditional workshop model, kind of based on the Iowa workshop and the way a lot of creative writing across the country is taught, the workshop instructor is a godlike figure, and everyone's sitting, listening to the instructor go through and say what works, what doesn't work, and other people's pieces. The other students in that classroom take cues from that instructor. And, there's all these like hierarchical kind of questions about bias and how that plays out post the murder of George Floyd in 2020. There were all these amazing essays, all these amazing articles about creative writing workshops specifically, and how they reinforced some of the, sense of like institutionalized racism, chauvinism, in the way that traditional workshops ran. And so they have like a unique it's just a unique population. It's not like a elite Ivy League school. It's not a state school. And so the way I teach has to be reactive to the people who like show up in my classroom. And like they in all honesty, they do not care. Like I really believe it in a really powerful way. Like they don't care how many books, how many awards. They just want to be engaged. They want to learn how to like write and share their story. So it's like the most effective I can be in as an instructor is to like try and give them some tools and then like get out of the way.
Yeah. Yeah, and especially when you're talking about, just the idea of trigger warnings and kind of giving people a heads up ahead of time. I mean, if they're in such a supportive environment and they're reading with their peers and they have, someone on standby, I can imagine that it would feel a lot easier than, a kid picking up a book. And I mean, I don't know if I even believe that though, because I think that's part of the glory of the whole thing. But I could see, in this environment you're describing that group could be really helpful.
Yeah, if
That work.
they feel support, hopefully, and they feel, I think what they're lacking. I mean, I'm sure when I was 18 or 19, you know, lacking confidence, lacking context, and if you practice that in class, like if you actually practice how to read, the idea that like when you read like a really powerful piece of writing, you don't just read one word after the other, line by line by line by line, that like you give yourself opportunities to pause and stop. And so like when we're reading in class, like we'll read a couple sentences and stop and we'll talk about it. Then we'll read a couple more and then we'll stop and talk about it. Then we'll go back and be like, hey, did you notice this image at the beginning? And now it came up again. And so like what I'm trying to do is encourage them to explore writing with some degree of confidence. Because if you just hand Morrison or Faulkner or Dennis Johnson or Louise Erdrich, if you just hand them a novel, they're going to read a couple sentences and generally feel like overwhelmed by the language, by the imagery. Like, this is too much. It's the depth of the right. Like, they just don't have the context for it. And so you're helping them practice, like, oh, it's okay to read a sentence and not understand it. And in fact, there's actually something really beautiful about, as a reader, unpacking, decoding the language and coming up with an idea of what the meaning behind. And actually, this writer, like, is giving you this opportunity. This sentence is purposely built so that you get to bring your experience and decode it. And that, like, this writer built this sentence or paragraph in a way where it is meant to be challenging. It's not meant to be obvious, and you have to do a little work. And the more that they get that experience, the more that, instead of just reading horizontally across the line and then down the page, they start really understanding, like, oh, there's this whole thing with language that I maybe wasn't even aware of until I started reading some of these authors. And that's like, you said, like, that's what's beautiful, or that is the power when you're kind of reading alone and you're making all these connections, you're having a conversation with the writer. Like, that's what you're trying to get them to, I think. It just takes practice.
Yeah. Well, it's funny because I mean, I think, when we grow up a certain way, you don't immediately realize that there are other ways to grow up and that there are different ways to come about this. I mean, I just feel like I found all these books in the library when I was a kid, and they were mine, and they live in my head, you know?
Yeah, and your experience probably was closer to mine, where it was like, "Oh, I fell in love with this thing. I sought out these different writers. I was trying to challenge myself in high school. I was reading, like, more and more adult, challenging, established canonical writers. I went to school with some sense of what writing was, and that's fine because in the '70s and '80s, you had film, television, the very beginning of video games, but mostly, a lot of stories were still being told through alphabetic text, still being told through literature. There was no competition, and now students, like I said, most of their engagement is online, on their phone. It's through images, it's through video games, it's through Instagram, it's through TikTok, and so just the amount of text that they're exposed to, it might be just like a couple books that they're looking at in high school, or some writer that they really love and they've read like a trilogy or 10 books from. But outside of the world of a particular genre or a particular writer, they just haven't had those experiences. So then it's like you come into like a writing class as an 18-year-old and someone's like, hey, we're going to read this really challenging text. We read Bastard out of Carolina by Dorothy
Oh,
Allison.
that was the one that was in your essay, yeah.
And I love that book so much, and
Mhm.
I had the chance to meet Dorothy
Oh,
a couple times over the years, and just was like such a phenomenal person, such a phenomenal writer. Her story about, growing up and dealing with abuse, and it's just so powerful. And we were reading this, it was like the first day of class. It was a novel writing class. And at the break, the student came up to me and said, very direct, like in such a pointed way, like, I don't like this book and I don't like you. Nope. And I don't like this class. It, and I'm going to drop this class.
wow.
And I was so like, oh my gosh, I was so taken aback because one, I didn't write the book.
Yeah.
Like two, I mean, I selected it, but, and
You're
was like,
complicit.
yeah, I chose it, and I was like, oh God. And, I felt horrible. I felt so, so horrible. And then, like, I got an email later that night from the student who said, like, I'm so sorry. I wasn't expecting that book to be what it was. I think I'm gonna stay in the class. And they stayed and they ended up, like, getting a lot out of the class, taking another class with me. But it was that initial reaction of, like, if you go from Harry Potter
Right.
or Sarah J. Maas or some other like fantasy or romance fantasy writer into Dorothy Allison's Bastard Carolina, where there's like a car crash like on the first page, and it's like all about all the different family members who die. Like it's a really, really difficult transition. And that doesn't even, like take into account kids who are neurodivergent or kids who might have anxiety. Like it's just a it's just a way more complicated equation, I think, in some ways now, where the expectation 10, 15 years ago is like, hey, first day of class, we're gonna read Dorothy Allison's Bastard Out of Carolina. And that was it.
And that would
And
be
so
that.
now yeah, and now I'm just much more aware, like, hey, we gotta like whenever the first day of class is, whatever text we're gonna start off, I have to be like, hey, this is an essay, and it's gonna deal with this writer's experience the first time, being hassled by the police, and
Yeah.
we're gonna talk about it afterwards, and maybe it reminds you of some of your own like, and so just yeah, the way we interact with literature has changed, I think, as a culture, and I don't think it's good or bad, it just has changed, and so the way I'm trying to get students to engage with it is also slightly different.
Yeah, it's funny that you said that. I think I've mentioned on this podcast before, but my daughter read we were reading The Giver with her. She's 8.
Oh, wow,
So
that's an incredible book.
but the scene where the dad, I'm sure everyone who's listening has read The Giver, but the scene where the dad, euthanizes the baby, my daughter didn't understand at first, and then she just started sobbing, and she didn't wanna read the book, and she hated the book, and she picked the book up and threw it across the room, and that's I feel like that's what happened with your student is that they felt it, they felt something, and they didn't want it inside them, and they didn't wanna feel it, and I think that it's really, really important for us to feel this stuff, and so she and I talked about it, and we discussed, like, this character isn't real, this didn't happen, but this is an example of things that could happen, these are it's having us have a conversation like this right now, and we talk about it, and she read the rest of the book and really loved it, and I just I I don't know, I really worry about how hard life is if, if we're gonna uh, if we're afraid of books, then
Yeah,
life is gonna be hard.
yeah, but I think the way you describe that, Michelle, is, like, actually really beautiful, and the way I talk about it in classes and the way I've thought about it, especially even with my own kids, is like, this is the unintended consequence of having stable, functional families.
Yes, yes,
Like,
exactly.
like, if you are doing your job as a parent and, it's, like, relatively calm, there's certainty at home,
Yeah.
like, people are generally emotionally
They have
regulated, they have food, the lights are on, like, like
all by magic.
no, but genuinely that, like, that if the family unit is functioning and a kid doesn't have to enact, like, some adult roles before the age of, like, 15 or 18 or whatever it is, right? Like,
Mm.
that gives them the privilege of living in this world of, like, certainty and safety, and that's, like, actually really, really beautiful. Like, that's a great consequence, and maybe that's why some of these like, my students are so earnest and so open and so empathetic because they do grow up now it's like the difference like, you could look at maybe the population breakdown and be like, "Well, in the '70s and '80s, most families had 4 kids." My wife grew up in a family of 6 kids, right? And so, like, she just got exposed. Her older brother, the oldest in the family, was, like, almost 20 years older, right? And so, like, she got exposed as a kid to much more adult kinda challenges or teenage challenges, and so, like, you just grew up way faster. There was a time we were talking about this with our kids the other day. Like, when I was in maybe 5th grade, like, we were in art class, and they wheeled a TV in, and they turned the TV on, and there was a space shuttle lifting off. And we all, like, paused from our art projects to look up, and the space shuttle lifted off, and then it exploded. And it was the space shuttle
Yeah.
Challenger, and they turned the TV off. No one said anything.
Oh my god.
There was no teacher who was like,
But didn't know what to say.
no one knew what to say. And instead of like saying something, even if it was wrong, or like later that day, like, hey, we're gonna have a meeting and talk about our feelings, or the next day, or later that week,
They're just
well,
like,
2 days later. It happened because everyone talked about it
"Oh,
after school, and it was replayed over and over, and that image was replayed over and over. But at no point did anyone say like, "Hey, you saw this really, like, terrifying, really tragic thing." The reason that that happened, Michelle, is because, Krista McAuliffe was a teacher, school teacher, and she was going on the space shuttle, and so they, like, set this thing up with all these schools across the country so that school
oh, I did
children
that."
could watch it happen, and, but nobody was like, "How are you feeling right now?" Like, nobody asked at any point, like, "Hey, you just witnessed this really, like, strange, difficult, tragic things here," and
Awful.
it is, but also, like, it so you're like, "Oh, okay, I guess that can happen. I guess that's a thing that can happen, that, like,
Life is short.
something."
Now you know.
Well, not even just life is short, like, something beautiful and interesting and something that was meant to be hopeful could quickly turn tragic, and guess what? No one's gonna ask you about it, no one's gonna, like, help you unpack it, you're just gonna have to figure some of this stuff out, you know? And so, like, that forced a lot of agency, a lot of independent, like, it forced you to figure, like, my parents got separated and then divorced when I was, like, really young, and that forced you to, like, take some ownership, some agency in a way that my kids probably haven't had to. And so, like, it's, to me, it's this beautiful benefit that, like, kids are growing up in these spaces, you know, or these family units where they're not having to confront some of these questions in quite the same way.
Right.
They have their own challenges, like, they might not have to watch some cataclysm or tragedy and never have a parent or teacher ask them their feelings, but what they do have is this, like, incessant white noise that is inescapable, you know, this,
Mm.
because of social media, because of the internet, they just have in the background of every moment of their life this, like, constant buzzing of, like, different kinds of small to large catastrophes that, you know, maybe, like, that thing that happened when I saw the space shuttle explode, that was probably the only bad thing nationally or internationally that I was aware of for, like, 5 years.
Yeah,
And then,
that's a
like,
good point.
you know, like, 5 years later, something would happen, be like, "Oh,
Not every damn day.
he was not 5 times a day,"
Yeah.
you know? And so, it's like, maybe I was actually lucky. Maybe I was the soft one, you know? Like, maybe I was the one, like, I didn't have to think about the world. I couldn't even tell you who the president was, I think, until I was in high school, you know? Like, I didn't have to think about some of the, you know, my kids have grown up in this world where they're constantly thinking about climate change. My daughter's like, "You have to recycle." I was like, "I am recycling," you know?
Doing it.
Like,
I'm doing it right now.
but they're like, if you accidentally put it in the wrong trash can, it's like, they're like, "You're stealing air from the future planet. Like, I'm suffocating because you didn't recycle this." And it's not like being dramatic because they know, you know, where, like, they've had to grow up with the just horrible uncertainty of, um, you know, Donald Trump in the background and just the meanness, the, like, outright cruelty that, politics have embraced over the last, you know, 10 years or so, and so, like, that's all there, and I'm like, "Oh, maybe it's better to, like, watch the space shuttle and deal with that and not have to deal with this tension, uneasiness, uncertainty, like, on a daily basis." And so, like, when in, you know, a class, you ask them to read a book where it is this very specific, terrifying challenge, like, I could see why your daughter's like, "I don't want this."
Yeah.
Like, that's the
It's
most
like it invaded
sensible.
her brain and just made her so sad that she just couldn't handle it.
But that's beautiful, like, to me, that is beautiful, and that to me is probably why you as a parent choose to read a book, like we read with our kids, all the way up until I think both of them were in 3rd or 4th grade, and then they're like, "We're gonna read on our own." And that was great. But, like, there's a reason you do that with your kid. It's not just for language acquisition. It's not just for, like, community and, like, a sense of bonding. It's because they're practicing. Like, when you're reading Harry Potter, when you're reading The Giver, like, The Giver, that's, like, a challenging, really compelling book, and that, like, you're practicing dealing with some of the unfairness, some of the, like, terror in the adult world in this fictional way. So to, like, throw the book down, to me, like, makes complete sense. Like, of course, like, who wants tragedy? Like, who wants this as part of your life? You're like, this is why we're watching a movie where the character doesn't necessarily get their goal or where a character dies. And it's like you're practicing these uncertainties so that when they occur in your actual life, you're like, oh, I have context. I've seen something like this before. I mean, this is why humans tell stories.
I know, I was just gonna say that, yeah, exactly, yeah. It's like, I'm gonna help you have this experience so that if you don't have it, you're prepared for when.
Yeah, you're like, I'm gonna break your heart.
Yeah,
Like I'm gonna break your heart so that you can practice having your heart broken so when it, like, really happens, it doesn't totally destroy you.
yep, yeah, that's exactly right. Joe, man, I don't wanna keep you for very long, but we haven't even talked about the books that have shaped you. Okay, so I really wanna talk to you about Between Everything and Nothing. Um, uh, like, I've been trying to get away from spending as much time as I, typically do talking to an author about their own work and focus on the books that they read that made them who they are, but we have to wait because this book was really I haven't finished it actually, so but anyway, okay, so as I understand it, it's your first work of nonfiction. Can you summarize the journey of these 2 men from Ghana for people, if you don't mind? I don't know if you are okay with that.
Sure. Yeah, happy to do that. So, Between Everything and Nothing is a nonfiction book. It follows two men who traveled from Ghana and West Africa. These two men didn't know each other, even though they were both from the same small community in Accra. And they traveled at different times, starting in South America, making their way through Central America up to California, where they both applied for asylum in the mid 2010s. And so the book is an examination of the US asylum policy, which since these events happened
Yeah,
in
like, you wrote this
2012.
before all the ICE stuff. I mean, this is
But the asylum,
true. Yeah, that's different.
yeah,
That's a different
it
thing.
it hasn't shifted all that much. President Trump signed some executive orders that altered a couple of the ways refugees can apply for asylum, and especially in the last 2 weeks, there's been some additional changes. But the basic premise that as a refugee, you can apply for asylum in the United States. There's this system in place where you're forced to self-advocate unless you have the resources to pay for an immigration lawyer, and then you go through this immigration court process while you're waiting in jail. And, because very few refugees, folks who apply for asylum, have any of the resources to pay for
Yeah,
a
court.
lawyer, let alone pay for a bond while they're awaiting their asylum trial. They're forced to wait in these correctional facilities that are privately operated. And so it's this incredibly complicated, incredibly anti-democratic system that really betrays the most basic ideals of the United States. And the I had the opportunity to interview these two men, Seydou and Razak, who were just brave enough to share their story. I spent 3 years interviewing them, conducted over 60 hours of interviews, and what I try to do is to tell their story in their own words through their own experiences of what it took for them to leave their homeland, why they left, the incredible, like, physical, emotional, psychological journey just to show up, to apply for asylum, and that once they, entered the asylum process, this whole other journey that unfolded afterwards.
Mm.
And I feel like as someone, I would say I feel relatively aware of some of the policies of the United States. I just had no idea. It was just this incredible education into purposeful obstruction, purposeful obstacles that are set up for individuals who are seeking safety in the United States. And it's also like this incredibly beautiful, I'll just say one thing, like, these two men who both left Ghana, this small kind of West African country, and then went through South America, Central America, made their way through the asylum process, were awaiting deportation. They ended up meeting these two strangers, these two men in this bus station
So
in Minneapolis, and they saw each other. It was the day before Christmas Eve. So December 23rd, 2016, right after Donald Trump had been elected, they saw each other across this bus station. They could somehow recognize from their clothing, their demeanor, physicality, whatever, that they were both African. One of the one of the guys walked up to the other, Seydou, who's like a little more outgoing. He's a soccer player. He like walked up to the other guy, and he just said this phrase, "Nataka," which in their dialect means like, "Where are you going?" And they miraculously not only spoke like the same dialect, they were both Muslim, they were both from the same small community in Accra. Like, the fact that these two men found each other and then kind of tried to navigate this unjust system together, it's an incredible, it's just an incredible story that gives you hope, but
yeah,
also
but also
presents, yeah,
yeah,
difficulty and the reality. And really, the it just plainly states the disparities between what's promised, the way we think of ourselves as a country, and what the reality for most asylum seekers is.
yeah. So my question is, why did you write this book? And I want to tell you that my motives are that, I've talked to a couple of my guests about the ways we've all tried to change things and how we've used literature in some instances and how we've used our other, methods like an economist or me as a lawyer or, somebody's a journalist like you. And I am curious if you wrote this book because you felt like the fiction that you write, which I mean, has a ton of depth, is not really cutting it, or if this was something you wanted to try or, like, where you were at, you know?
I think, well, so there's a couple of different answers. One, from the time I was publishing short fiction, published my first novel, I was always writing nonfiction, whether that was music journalism, whether it was interviews with other artists or musicians, whether it was features. I've done a lot of writing for, places like the Chicago Reader, for New City, for Time Out Chicago, for Chicago Magazine. And so I've just done a lot of cultural journalism, really from the beginning. But I had never thought about trying to write a book length work of nonfiction. There was just no story that I come across that felt like, "Oh, I'm gonna spend 3 years just, like, doing research, um, into a particular question or topic." And then Donald Trump was elected in 2016. You mentioned your daughter reading The Giver and throwing it down. My daughter was in 3rd grade in 2016 when Donald Trump was elected. She dressed up as, like, Ruth Bader Ginsburg for Halloween that year.
Yeah.
And so she was so engaged with, that particular presidential race. She was really excited about the possibility of Hillary Clinton being elected as the first female president. And, like, right before she went to sleep that night, she's like, if she wins, will you wake me up?" And I was like, "Yeah, I'll definitely wake you up." And then the next morning she came down and she was like, "You didn't wake me up."
Yeah.
And I just, like, I didn't even know what to say. because she had listened, like, she had paid attention when the Access Hollywood tape came out. She, like, we had to explain to, a 3rd grader, like, what the context of that was, and I think, like a lot of people, we were just so certain that this person was a vulgarian and he wouldn't be elected, and then when he was, it kinda upset the entire, like, political, cultural worldview of my family, friends, large
Community, everyone.
yeah, and so it was like that moment you describe where you, like, throw the book across and you're like, "I don't want this.
Yeah.
I don't want this." I just wanna be clear, this is not even political.
Yeah.
It's not like this to me is not a question of politics. It's really a question of culture, like, um, who we are as, like, as a group of people and, like, what do we value, what's permissible, what's not permissible, like, some of those questions predate Donald Trump's election,
Right.
beginning with, like, reality TV and the e but that event, it was, like, so, um, upsetting, discordant, and I felt, like a lot of people in conversations afterwards, just this sense of powerlessness, this feeling of disengagement, and, I've been very politically active, working for places like Punk Planet throughout the early 2000s, and, just this feeling of like, "Oh, like, I'm a writer, like, what do I even do right now? And what am I gonna do for the next 4 years to feel like I'm still participating?" And just a couple weeks really after the election, a friend of mine who's a television and film producer up in Canada contacted me, and he's like, "Hey, I met these guys, and I think you should come up and interview them." And, it was these 2 men, Razak and Seydu, and originally I flew up to Winnipeg where they were at to interview them just as, like, a short essay or short, like, feature piece. And this, like, really strange thing happened where we were like, I I sat down with them, we were in this little room, and before I could, like, turn the tape recorder on, I think Razak, just started speaking, and he jumped right into this moment where him and Seydu were, like, crawling through the snow on their stomachs
Oh,
trying to
he
get.
started it there too. Yeah, that's
Yeah, and
interesting.
so he just, like, got into it, like, before I had even really asked any questions, and I was like, "Oh, Jesus," and I had to, like, turn on the tape recorder, and I can't remember, I think I maybe had to even ask him to start again,
Yeah.
and so he started telling this moment where the 2 of them, in order to escape this unjust deportation from the United States, they decided to cross into Canada. And they're, like, crawling through the snow. This is, like, 2 days before Christmas in 2016, in the middle of this snowstorm, like, trying to cross the border from the United States into Canada. This is, in North Dakota, and, the description of this, like, searchlight that was, like, spinning around, and they had to time their movement, so, like, every 2 minutes, it would circle back around, and so they would have, like, a minute and a half to, like, crawl and then stop, and then the searchlight would go, and then they'd go, like, in this, like, just incredibly physically arduous, terrifying moment, like, what these men were willing to risk
Yeah, ill-equipped
for
for
freedom, totally ill-equipped, had, like, never experienced winter.
right.
Or like these zero temperatures or like a snowstorm and the way that they were being asked. And it was just and I was like, even as he was like in the moment that he was describing this, I was like, oh, this is not an essay.
Yeah.
Like in the moment, in the moment he was, and then he would speak for a little while, and the Seydu would say something, and he would start telling from a different point in the story, and then Razak would pick up the story, and it kinda went back, and the first time I sat with them, I think it was, like, 3 hours of them just talking nonstop,
Oh gosh.
and I was like, oh, immediately I was like, I wanted somebody to witness. Yeah. I don't know, Michelle, without like resorting to like exaggeration or whatever, it was like one of those times in my life where you're like, I'm experiencing something I've never experienced before. It was like very emotional and kind of like overwhelming where you're like, I'm seeing something that's greater than the world that I know. Like you like out of the corner of your eye look into this other version of the world or dimension, however you want to think about it. It's like a moment of like
It's like you're in the cave and you finally see.
he stepped out, yeah,
Yeah.
because this moment of transcendence at the expense of these two men and how like they had this incredible story to tell, and they were just looking for an instrument. They were just looking for like a mode to share it. And I was like, oh, I was like, everybody needs to hear this story. Like everybody needs to hear this story told in the way they just told it. And so like I went back to this little hotel room and I was like listening to the tape, starting to like transcribe it. And I was like, this like will not work. This cannot work like for a 10, 15 page. There's no way like I can get this, like everything they just described from like the neighborhood they grew up in Ghana to like finding these other group of migrants who were leaving Brazil and going up through Central America to being robbed over and over and over again as they made their way through Central America to like meeting these men while they were being detained in the United States. And like, I was like, how, like, what? It was this collage of like images and like this documentary that was nonlinear. And I was like, how am I going to try and I was like, oh, this is just a book. Like, it just obvious, like, as I was transcribing it, I was like, "Oh, just stop. Like, just this is a book. Like, you need 300 pages to do this thing."
Yeah.
And so, like, I went back and talked to them and, the film producer who had introduced them to me, and they were trying to develop the material as, a documentary. And so I was like, "Hey, like, I I would love to just put this together as like as a book and see if someone would be interested in getting it out there because I think it's an incredible story."
Yeah.
It also like totally selfishly gave me a momentary feeling of like purpose and like,
Yeah.
oh,
Oh, I get it.
this is like one thing I can do right now is just like share these men that
And talk about platforms, you already have one,
yeah,
like, it's perfect, and you're a good storyteller. I mean, some people.
appreciate. When I was like, there's nothing, and it was similar to the teaching thing where it's like, this is not my story. All you have to do is get out of the way. Like, tell the story, tell it the way they told you, and just get out of the way. Like, just let the story, let their experiences be the focus. And so, yeah, we were fortunate to work with Counterpoint, who were this great publisher out of LA. They were very supportive.
They are growing, by the way. Much.
Yeah, and they're a great publisher, and they were willing to support the book. We got some really, really wonderful reviews and coverage. Just to like one more thing, like strangely, from the very beginning, during his early candidacy, like Trump made it clear that immigration was going to be the focus of his presidency, and that continues to this day. I live in Chicago, where we're currently occupied by ICE, and these questions have not gone away. The events in the book take place in 2016. They could be taking place right now, and the level of, like I said, cruelty, illegality, like all of those same questions are still, maybe even more so
Yeah.
at this particular moment. Like they're still unfortunately relevant. And yeah, it was a privilege. It was like looking back a couple years later, we were like, oh, what a remarkable opportunity to meet these two men, to play a very, very small part in helping share their story with the world. Like, I just think of that whole project as something that happened kind of outside of myself. And
kinda happened to you.
Well, or just like it's their story. Like I'm just here to, I'm just basically helping document, like put it together in a way that people can engage with it. Because like you can't take the whole world and put them in that room, like where they were telling the stories. Like, okay, so I'll just try and create a book that feels like that. Um, and so, yeah, that to this day feels like one of the most rewarding experience as a person, like just as a human, and let alone as like a writer, um, that I've had.
Yeah, I think it's pretty important, and I not to sound condescending, I don't know if this sounds condescending, I'm just really proud of you, like,
Oh, thank you.
I mean,
Thanks.
it's kind of a hard thing to do, right? Like, and you and I know, like, I love writing stories and fiction, and it's a different thing when you're writing someone's real story, because you have to be true to it, so you don't get to have a lot of the freedom that you might want, if it was yours, and, I think it's kind of a selfless thing, to be honest. So, I just wanted to bring it up because I couldn't get off the phone with you without talking.
Yeah, no problem.
Yeah. So, I know we should go. I never asked you anything about the books.
You did. We got to talk about Between Everything and Nothing,
No, but
and
not about your book.
oh, but the books that I love. So, I mean, I am more than happy to give a couple recommendations. Maybe it's like the best way I can think about it is like books that have been important to me and that like I return to feel inspired and humbled
Yes.
like over and over again. So there's definitely like a handful of books that I share with my students in that books like every couple years, maybe like 3 or 4 years, I'll just go back to feel like, oh, I still have so much kind of room to grow.
Mm.
You mentioned earlier being like a huge fan of short story collections. So there's this one collection by George Saunders called The 10th of December.
Yep. That's a
Um,
good one. Yeah, that's a really good one.
it's just formally really inventive. It's super humanistic, like super interested in complicated characters. It's like laugh out loud funny and also really poignant and heartbreaking and sad. The title story to me is like just kind of a masterpiece of short fiction, like one of the greatest short stories in the last 10 or 15 years, like just by itself.
Yeah.
Um, and so like, especially for short stories, for short fiction, that's like a book that I tend to go back to just to remind myself of like what can you do with like this form? Like what can you do with a short story?
Mm.
And yeah, and I love how innovative and inventive some of his choices are with the individual structures or like the language or even point of view in a couple of the different stories. There's another book that I use with my students, maybe like every couple years we'll read it, and that's Louise Erdrich's The Roundhouse,
Yeah.
which is a novel and that she won the National Book Award for. It is like, to my mind, probably like one of the most compelling American novels of the last like 50 years. It's about a young man. He's 13, living on a reservation in North Dakota. He's a American Indian and Native American, and his mother is attacked, and it he chooses to try and find out who attacked his mom and bring this person to justice. So it has like elements of suspense, kind of
Some
mystery.
quest. Yeah.
It's a quest, it's a journey story, but it's very powerfully grounded. It's very, very realistic. There's these beautiful form shifts throughout where the boy's grandfather tells these rich stories that feel like folkloric or mythical that reflect back on the larger questions of the book. And it just is like, oh, this is why the novel exists as a form. Like the richness, the depth, the complexity of the characters, the complexity of the question. You're like, oh, this is why you need 300 pages to tell this story.
Which is funny because, like, tracks and love medicine, or I don't know if they're both story collections or if they're novels and stories, I can't remember now, but they're more episodic, and
Yeah,
she can do all of it.
yeah, she's in my mind the greatest living American writer. She just does everything, and she does it with such depth and focus on human complexity and also, like, great, great storytelling, and
Mm.
also on top of that, like, "Oh, in every book, I'm gonna try something new stylistically or formally," and so, like, there's nobody, at least for novels, in my mind, who comes even close. The closest would be Toni Morrison before she passed away, and, like, she just she's just incredible. She's, like, capacious,
Mm.
like, and yeah, sh the so many students, when we read her work, just suddenly make this connection between the place they grew up, the people they know, their own culture, and being able to bring that into a fictional world in an interesting, relevant way. So, yeah, like, the Roundhouse, I could just go back to that book and every time find something new, um, that I just wasn't even aware of, that you make kinda deeper connections, um,
Yeah, that's
to.
awesome.
Yeah, it's really wonderful. Another, novel is On Earth We're Briefly Gorgeous by Ocean Vuong,
Yep.
which
People have
is
some interesting ideas there.
I love that.
I really liked it, and I don't know, but
I
I feel people have
so
been really harsh.
well, because the book asks something of you as a reader in terms of, like, building complex characters. It's about a narrator who has this very complicated relationship with his mother, also a complicated relationship with his culture as a Vietnamese American, also this complicated relationship, with this young man that he's in a relationship, a physical relationship with,
Yeah.
and so, um, it it asks something of you. It's nonlinear, and Ocean Vuong uses this really powerful, rich,
He's a poet.
language. He's a
Yeah.
poet, and that book was started off as a poem. The original title, the title comes from a poem that he wrote before he decided to take some of those ideas and transform it into a novel. And about 2/3 of the way through the novel, the book shifts form into, like, poetic verse. It doesn't rhyme. It's like, there's no end rhyme. It's like just free verse, and you it's like the deconstruction, the shift of this relationship, of the town where the narrator is living, like, the shift to poetry feels so thoughtful and powerful and surprising, and, it really, for me, like, reminds you the word novel means new, right? Like, it's Italian word, it comes from novella, it means new, and that, like, for novels to exist as um, cultural objects, they have to be re-enlivened, they have to be reimagined, they have to be reinvigorated, and so, like, this book feels like it reimagines the form in a really exciting way.
It's interesting too because I feel like poetry is, kind of the closest you can get to music and literature in a way. I mean, I don't know how you feel about it. I know music's
Yes.
important to you, but and I was kind of wondering like what made you know or what gave you a hint that you could sort of combine these things for yourself, right? Like, I mean, was it like books like Sonny's Blues or, Nocturnes or like ways that people have tried to incorporate music into literature? Or, I mean, I just think it's very innovative and interesting. And I can see wanting to have all of the things you love in one place. And it's a tough, tough job, right? Like,
Yeah, I think, well, in the case of that novel, the idea that, well, so much like storytelling is about pattern building.
yeah.
And as the story goes on, those patterns have to shift, they have to break. You're trying to do the same thing in a novel. You establish these patterns, you break them, you establish new patterns, you break them again. And that goes for, like, the form or the tone, but also, like, the mode. And the idea that, like, 2/3 of the way through, you're like, actually, I'm going to move from prose into this, like,
Mhm.
poetic mode now. It seems, like, so apt, and, like, I love. Well, my favorite thing in a short story, my favorite thing in a film, my favorite thing in a novel is like 2/3 of the way through when the story suddenly opens up,
Mhm.
when you realize like, "Oh, this is a story about a character and a conflict in a place," but about like 2/3 of the way through, the story opens up in a way where you're like, "Oh, this is not just about this character and conflict in place. It's about the world, or it's about this bigger question." And the, shift to poetry in that book feels like it mirrors that,
Yeah.
opening, and I love that feeling, like, and so there's a lot of different novelists who do something similar in a different way.
Mm.
I think what feels so powerful is it's, like, brutally honest, the language, it's really Ocean Vuong's talked about it being rooted in his own experience, and you, like, feel that as you're reading, that what you're, reading, even though it's fiction, feels lived in. It feels like the characters, the places are, coming from the author's own experience. And as much as I am a fan of like imaginative writing, fabulous writing, magical realism, science fiction, like as much as I am fan, like to read a book that feels so direct and real, like it just is incredibly powerful. And for students, like I actually read it with some students this semester, and they were so inspired. Like it gave them permission. I think in the culture right now, like there's such an emphasis on spectacle, on bigness, on like massiveness, on like not just one movie, 3 movie trilogy. It's not just a TV show, it's 5 seasons, like bigger, bigger, bigger. And that the focus of the book is on these really small, powerful moments and like real moments from somebody's life. And to um, give permission to yourself as a writer to be like, oh, I probably have some really powerful material if I like think about my own experiences, my memory, like, and then it doesn't have to be over the top, otherworldly for it to be interesting or dramatic.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, it just takes a lot of bravery to be honest.
Yep, exactly, exactly. And that's, I mean, that's one of the things that's so engaging about that book. It feels brave in a lot of different ways.
Ugh, okay, well, I have kept you for much, much too long. I think that we can both agree to that.
It was such a pleasure. Thank you so much, Michelle. I really appreciate the opportunity.
Yeah, this has been really great, and I can't believe you said yes. I can't believe you showed up, and I am very grateful. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Yeah, and thanks for having these conversations with other writers and giving folks a space to think about books in a like meaningful, personal way.
Thank you so much for listening. Until next time, and in the words of my daughter,
Let's hip hop our way out.